Welcome to the Sustainability Series webinar today. My name is Carrie-Ann Kohler-Monroe. I'm an Environmental Program Specialist with Alberta Agriculture, Forestry and Rural Development. I'm not turning on my camera today as there was some issues earlier, and I think it would just go a little bit smoother if I didn't turn on my camera. And I know our presenter's camera is working nicely, so that's good. Just to let you know, the Sustainability Series webinars address agriculture's industry's approach and initiatives on sustainability. There is recorded previous webinars available on the Sustainability Series YouTube playlist, which would have been in a link that you in your calendar invite or the invitation. So the topic today, so we're all very passionate about agriculture in Alberta. We have valuable information to share, but it's changing with this new media age. So really, how do we get our message to stick with Albertans? Finding that interaction and intersection between what you want to say and what your audience wants to hear is really tricky. Earlier this year, Agriculture, Forestry and Rural Economic Development worked with the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity to gather insights on key message composition that would help create a positive impression of agriculture in Alberta. So today our presenter is my colleague, Laura Ung. Laura is an evaluation specialist in the Natural Resource Management branch with our ministry. After being in the evaluation field for 15 years, Laura appreciates the value of key messages that get noticed and are understood by the audience and the challenges associated with key message writing. Growing up on a cropping farm that is now a residential subdivision, she sees the importance of communicating agriculture's story to a growing segment of Albertans that may be less familiar with the industry. So Laura's going to present and then we'll have a question and answer. So feel free to use the question and answer box and we'll have a discussion after the presentation. And thank you for joining us today. And I will pass it off to Laura. Laura.
Great, thank you so much, Carrie-Ann, and thank you to everyone for lending us a moment out of your busy days to hear about some key message testing research that we completed with the Centre for Food Integrity. So I'd also like to thank the Sustainability Series for supporting this presentation today. I really do appreciate being able to discuss some of the highlights from this research with everyone. We will be sending out the slides of this presentation, and there's also 2 CCFI reports that we will be able to send to all of the webinar participants after this session. So in the reports, there are way more detail than what we were able to cover today, but at least this will give you a taste of what you'll see in the reports, and then also some messaging around what some of those results sort of mean to us. So with that, I'll just get right on into it. And why did we do this research? Well, really, this research sort of came about from some experiences that we had with our public trust information sharing network, which is made up of Canadian Agriculture Partnership Public Trust Program grant recipients. And it was in conversations with these groups that it was identified it would be quite helpful to better understand how to write and compose key messages that would resonate with Albertans and help build trust in Alberta's agri-food system. So the objective of this study was to determine the most effective messaging that would help build trust. And I find that these results, I think, will help us better understand how Albertans react to certain elements in a message, whether it's positive or negative. And I feel that these results are transferable across many different topics. So hopefully you'll walk away today with some insights that you may be able to immediately apply to your key message writing. And well, in the very least, you'll receive 2 reports from attending this webinar. So we'll get right into it and just give a quick overview of the processes that we did to get to our results. So firstly, we had CCFI actually research and do a review of some of their existing public trust information to identify what was important to Albertans when it comes to the agri-food system. And then we worked together, AFRED staff and CCFI and Ipsos, to collaborate on developing a set of initial key messages to test in our qualitative assessment. And then we got those results after that process. And then, and Ipsos used their community discussion platform to get feedback from participants on those initial set of key messages. And then we were able to build on that for a qualitative assessment. And this is where we used a survey that went out to Albertans to get further feedback on their reactions to particular key messages. And then to today, having those 2 pieces of research information can then provide those insights into how to effectively draft key messages. So this presentation, we will be focusing a little bit more on the results of this process and some of the lessons learned and considerations for key message development, rather than necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of the research results. The reports will definitely provide lots of information, and if you like to nerd out on those results and that data, you'll appreciate receiving those reports for sure. All right, so I mentioned that CCFI was going to do a review of previous research to identify what areas were important to Albertans in regards to the agri-food system. And what emerged was economy, sustainability, and values. So those were important areas to Albertans based on their previous public trust research. As we were creating our messaging around these 3 areas, we also had some other parameters that we wanted to keep in mind. And it was that the key message itself and the information within the key message had to be something that was proven and that we could find that evidence for. So these weren't opinion-based key messages. They were very much information-informed key messages. And there had to be no more than 3 sentences long, and that's sort of a normal sentence. We didn't do, we tried to avoid run-on sentences, as we typically like to get lots of information out there. We did try to keep it short. So we had short and sweet messages, and then we had ones that were a little bit longer. And then we also wanted messages that would age well, so that they could either easily be updated in the future with more current information, so that we had some efficiencies. Once you write a good key message, then if you're getting more current information, you can just update that key message and use it in the years to come. So those are the key topic areas that CCFI identified meant a lot to Albertans, and we took those key messages that we drafted and went into our qualitative assessment. So how we did that research is we CCFI worked with Ipsos Conversations community to actually look at the key messages, and these community members sort of took part in an online bulletin board style activities, and they were invited to answer a series of questions about each of the key messages, and then they were actually invited to discuss the results sort of among themselves. So we presented kind of 4 to 5 statements for each of those key topic areas for the community to respond to. And then we collected positive and negative reactions, as well as some of the conversations between members. And in this a group, they did reach 60 community members that went through this process, and you can kind of see on the table to the right sort of the demographics and the participant numbers for each of those areas. All right, so we'll just dive into what were some of the positive and negative reactions in each of those key topic areas. So our approach to the economic statements was that we really tried to paint a picture of the whole value chain and the system, not just the farmer or the retailer, but sort of the whole picture. We also used a variety of ways to portray a metric. So we used whole numbers, and then we used the percentage version of that number, just to really test how do people respond to how different information is portrayed. And then we also tried to say the same thing kind of different ways. We were really trying to take, some risks with this research, because it was sort of our safe place. And if we don't test different ways, we're not going to necessarily get that wholesome feedback that we were looking for on how Albertans react to some of our messaging. So in the positive reactions to some of our key messages that were centered around the economy is that they really like to see large dollar numbers, and that they also like to see the large employment numbers. There's some positive reaction to that, and also current information. I know some of our information can get a couple of years older, and it is important to either say why that information might be out of date, or use the most current information that's available. And then you can kind of see on the right-hand side there of your screen, those were just some of the quotations from the discussions that the community members had with themselves. All right, now we'll get into the juicier stuff, the negative reactions. So what didn't Albertans like to hear? As with everyone, no big surprise, they didn't like acronyms, and not even the common ones. And to be honest, maybe we didn't necessarily write the perfect message, and I think that's okay. But we did use GDP, we thought that was a fairly common acronym, but it wasn't. So they didn't respond well to that. And then also small percentages. So as I said, and you'll see in the bottom quote here that food production industry contributes only 3.3, which is quite low. The other flip side of that, it was in relation to jobs in the sector. And it was closer to 70,000 jobs, which received the positive reaction, versus the 3.3, which it was the same, but it was perceived as quite low. So it was actually, I think, a positive thing that we got some negative reactions, because that's what part of this research is about, is being aware of what may be a negative trigger out there. Okay, so then we'll get into the sustainability suite. And what we found with our approach with these was to actually provide some more specific numbers, in particular around beneficial management practices that farmers are using on their operations. And then we also wanted to present information around sector collaboration and kind of get some feedback on how that was received. So for the statements around sustainability, we found that those really centered around farmers' conservation efforts was positively received. Also, those messages that were perceived to be that farmers are being proactive was also positive. And then messaging that focused on the individual farmer versus the industry was actually better received or was more positively received than necessarily the industry at large. So I found that was quite interesting. And then on the negative side, again, because we tried to use messaging that we don't typically use because we wanted to see what the response would be. We did have messaging around farmers being subject to resource management legislation, and this was actually more negatively received. They didn't necessarily respond well to understanding that there was government legislation out there for producers. So again, this was a fairly interesting result, as was the percentages related to adoption of sustainable practices. So whereas we thought the adoption rates were fairly high, I would have considered them, pretty good adoption rates. That was not that I don't share the same perspective as a majority of Albertans out there. They felt those adoption rates were negative in their eyes. All right, so our last topic area was values, and what were some of the positive reactions around there. So again, we posed statements that were related to what was really important to Albertans, especially around supporting farmers, the use of technology, and being transparent in the food system. So the positive reactions was that, it was nice to know that government is supporting the industry. And then also there's some positive reactions to technology and transparency. On the negative side, again, it was in relation to adoption of practices, and again, 60% was perceived low. In all of the value key messages that we had, this was actually the only one that received a negative reaction. All the other components and elements of those key messages were positive. They were positively received. So really, messages about doing good are quite positive. All right, so kind of what did we learn, from a grand scale on doing some of this research, and some considerations for you guys moving forward? It's sort of that numbers versus percentages. We found that was quite polarizing. Some really liked the numbers, and then others really liked the percentages. So I think it might depend on your topic and what information you're trying to get across to make that decision, whether you use numbers or percentages. And then we also had the suggestion to actually use both, as that helps to increase context, understanding of context, and then also transparency. Another one was terminology. So one thing to kind of be wary of is those high-level concepts. So again, that was like GDP. It's high level. The participants in the community didn't necessarily relate to it, and it didn't have a lot of individual sort of meaning to them. So it wasn't personally relevant. And then also industry terminology. So in one of the key messages, we said food supply chain, and this was confusing to the community members. They weren't aware of what food supply chain necessarily meant. And then, of course, technical terminology. So again, we did use one word. It was understory. And that was confusing to members. But on the positive side, some of the members admitted that they had to Google the meaning of the word. So I think that's positive that they're willing to go out and Google something to get a better understanding. And then one last sort of key consideration for messaging, which I think is pretty positive out of this whole piece of qualitative assessment, is that after going through all of the messages, study participants really had a desire for more information. So once they were exposed to all of the key messages, they wanted more information. So I think that's great, and this is a positive result. And then these are kind of some areas that really caught their interest, and they said that they would actually like to know more information about how farmers are impacted by legislation. So whether it's time, cost, labor, also if there's any consequences for non-compliant. And then they wanted more specifics on sustainable agriculture practices. So even though the adoption percentages were perceived low, they still wanted to know more more about that. And then also more about how government is supporting industry and farmers on adopting sustainable farming practices. And then also information sources. So as I said, some, Googled some of the terminology, but I think if we can provide our information sources, whether it be a link to the source of that information, then that is will be well received by your target audience. So just in summary, what's really important here is that we found all of the statements left respondents feeling more positive about the agri-food industry. So that's a big key take-home message, is that even though there might have been some negative responses, on the whole, it left people feeling more positive about the agri-food industry. So that's great. And they were happy and pleasantly surprised that Alberta government is supporting industry and farmers in some of that transition to more sustainable food. And one of the quotes that we have received is that, oh, this is really nice because I thought Alberta was mostly oil and gas. So they were, happy to see that there's sort of other industries being supported out there. Most of the members felt that the statements were credible, and then those that actually felt otherwise required additional background and context and goal setting. So if you're going to say that, this is our result, then it might be helpful to put in a goal, say this is where we are, this is where we want to be, just to give that more understanding of context, and then also your source of information. If there's any concern over credibility, then they can always go to that information source, which increases transparency. And then there were a few consumers that felt a little bit disconnected from the statements, but this was really due to lack of understanding of either government's role or knowledge of the agri-food industry. So that's really where we're trying to drive at, is increasing knowledge. And then if we can get people feeling a little bit more connected to the industry, that's a positive thing. And then again, here we are with the statements that use numbers or percentages to illustrate positive effects of the agri-food industry on the economy and the environment. Those were generally better received by the members. And then again, some members did find words confusing, like GDP and food supply chain, just mostly because they are vague and not personally relevant to them. So I think it's really good to test your messages with people, whether it's family or friends that are outside of the industry, and getting their take on your message. And then lastly, there is a desire for more information on, legislation, sustainable farming practices, government supports, all those types of things. They're looking for information, and I think that is a positive thing. All right, so building forward, I kind of mentioned we had this qualitative assessment where we looked at the different key topic areas around economic sustainability and values, and then we used that as a springboard for our quantitative assessment. So we decided to dive a little bit deeper into what we learned from the qualitative. We worked with CCFI, and then we worked with CCFI to dive a little bit deeper and identify that in our quantitative assessment, we wanted to look at jobs, economy, sustainable food production, agriculture producers, and government supports. So then we kind of went back to the drawing board and refined our key messages that we had used in the qualitative assessment for our quantitative assessment. So again, the study objective remains the same around finding how to write an effective key message to increase trust, but we did a different method. So this time we actually did an online survey, and it reached out to 801 Albertans over the age of 18 were involved in the study. And then on the right-hand side there, you kind of see the demographic breakdown of the different generations that we were able to reach through this study. All right, so we'll just dive right into it. And so this next little section, what we're really gonna learn about is the overall impression of agriculture in Alberta. And then also importance of the various food system factors. So again, if we want to make our messaging relevant to the regular Albertan, then it's important to make it personal to them. So it's good to understand how important the various food system factors are to them. And then finally, we'll look at some messaging composition, and we'll go over some targeting considerations for people. So we'll kind of get into the message composition and considerations for developing target messages. All right, so we'll get right into sort of our key findings around the impressions of Alberta agriculture. So on balance, Albertans hold a positive impression of agriculture in the province. 63% rated it as either very positive or somewhat positive. And so that's a great result that we have a good level of positivity in the province. And then really only 6% felt at all negative about the state of agriculture in the province. There were some demographic differences to consider. So on average, men are a little bit more positive than women. And then also boomers and Gen Xers are more positive than your millennials and your Gen Zers. And then what's also interesting is that Gen Z is like far and away more likely to report having very negative impressions of Albertan agriculture. So they rated it 12% versus 1% of everybody else that was over the age of 24. So this is kind of important to understand sort of where consumers are at in their perspective to the industry and how they may receive your messaging. All right, so we'll kind of get down break down into what's important to Albertans about the agriculture food system. I'm going to see if I can use my pointer. All right, there we go. All right, so you'll kind of see here that it's the cost of food and safety are thought to be the most important aspects of the Alberta food system, and then also jobs, the price of food and the role of the food system in Alberta's economy are viewed as being important by most. And then kind of by comparison, the environmental impact and using the latest science and technology in the food system are sort of less important relative to all the other areas. So you'll see here, this is the important top 3 boxes. So this is everyone that either rated it as a 10, extremely important, a 9 or an 8. That sort of makes your top 3 boxes. So even at 53 to 47, you're still getting, you know, just over half or almost half are feeling that these are quite important aspects of the food system. All right, we'll get into kind of some subgroups. So what does this look like from different demographics? So you'll see here that there are some generational differences. Gen Z are least likely, right here, to sort of indicate a high level of importance rating. So you can kind of see there was really only one, which is the cost of food, that kind of cracked the top half. And 2, so it's cost of food and food grown and the safety of food grown and produced in Alberta are important, but everything else sort of remains a little bit less in comparison to millennials, Gen X's, and boomers. They are much more likely to indicate a high importance rating. Also, there's some regional differences. So we were able to sort of separate out Calgary and Edmonton to all other Alberta, all the rest of Alberta. So there are regional differences between our urban and rural populations. I don't think that's super surprising. And then there are some gender differences as well in relation to the safety of food and the price of food, that women were more likely to say that that's important. And then what's also interesting is that there's some topic differences. So the use of latest science and technology in the food system was rated of least importance to boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. but not for Gen Zs. So Gen Zs rated only the cost of food and food safety higher than technology. So I felt that this was pretty interesting. And then considering that Gen Zers are also the ones that are more likely to be negative, it might be important to use technology as one of those components of your key messages. So it is important to kind of keep these types of considerations when you are targeting your key message writing. All right, so we'll get on to kind of our message testing, and this is sort of when you receive the report, this is kind of what the bulk of it is going to look like. So we did have these 5 key topic areas. So in the report, you'll see these 5 areas, but for the purposes of today's presentation, we're just going to look at what was sort of a good example of a key message and then a less effective. Because if you remember, all of our key messages were effective at creating a positive impression. It's just that some were better than others. So we are going to target in on jobs and then government supports as our examples to go through this. All right, so our first example is jobs. So this is the key message up here, is that the agri-food industry in Alberta employs 70,000 Albertans. So you'll remember we learned that from our qualitative assessment that they liked the bigger numbers. So we went with the bigger number rather than the 3.3%. And you'll see here that it was quite, people had a quite positive reaction to it. So they were asked for each of these statements to express whether they strongly agreed with the statement, somewhat agreed, somewhat disagreed, or strongly disagreed. And then here are the sort of totals of both of the agrees and the totals of both of the disagrees. So with, you know, the ratings in the high 90s and 80s, this one around jobs was received quite well. And then you can see there's quite a few that positively disagreed, if that makes sense, with the statement. So they did believe the statement, and they didn't think that there was too much information in that statement. So messaging that focuses on jobs and economic contributions of the Alberta food system tend to be quite well received. And this type of messaging might be easiest for Albertans to understand and strikes them as being the most important and believable, because it is something that they're more likely to be familiar with when it comes to jobs and employment. That's an area that they might have a little bit more understanding in. And then they also tended, which I thought was interesting, to say that they did learn something new after being exposed to the statement. So then we'll get into some of the demographic differences in here. So this is kind of what you'll see in the report. You'll see their different demographics for each of the generation, the region, and the gender. So in this instance, Gen Zs and millennials are actually among the most likely to feel as though the messaging contained too much information, or they didn't believe it compared to the Gen Xers and Boomers. And this, you know, might be with regards to they're feeling a little bit more separated from the agriculture sector and sort of where food comes from. So I thought that this was fairly informative. And then also that Boomers, they were statistically more likely to believe the statement that covers a topic that was important to them. So job statements was identified as something most important to Boomers as compared to the Gen Zs, millennials, and Gen Xs. So I probably should have talked about earlier. You'll see these little numbers beside the numbers when they're bolded, and that just means that they're statistically significantly different than the sort of corresponding column, right? So here, the other, all other places in Alberta were significantly different from people that were in Calgary. So sorry for not mentioning and making that a little bit more clear earlier. All right, so that was kind of an example of, or a good example. So what does it look like for a group that, or a key message that wasn't as well received, still effective at increasing overall impression of agri-food in Alberta, but just not as effective. So this is our other example around government supports and the farm technology program. So you can see it's a little bit of a bigger key message. And then it did receive a little bit more in the disagree column for that there was too much information or they didn't believe the statement as compared to our message around jobs. So there isn't quite as many that identified that they strongly agreed with the statement as again we saw with jobs. So but one thing to sort of keep in mind that despite all of this, nearly 9 in 10, so 87% admitted that the statement does make them have a more positive impression of agriculture in Alberta. So although it wasn't, you know, a perfect message by no means, it was still helpful in increasing that impression. So then we'll get into some of the demographic differences. So you'll see here, there aren't too many in this particular example, but for millennials. So millennials were statistically more likely to indicate that this gave them a more positive impression of agriculture than some of the other generations. All right, so that was just a couple of examples from our quantitative report, but really what does that all mean? What did we learn, and what are some of those considerations for message development moving forward? So I'd like to back it up a little bit as a refresher to our qualitative assessment. So considerations for that is really, again, those numbers versus percentages, that they are quite polarizing. So consider what kind of information you're trying to portray and figure out if a number or a percentage is better for you to use, or both, as it was suggested, because it can give the reader a bit of a clear picture and provide that comparison and relevancy. Terminology, that there was some difficulty in understanding certain words and phrases, so we really have to be careful to avoid jargon, and it's best to test those messages and that information with people outside of the food system. Also, setting goals to provide that context. So if your key message is has some sort of goal setting, I think that's important because it supports transparency. Because if you're communicating, this is where we are in relation to where we want to be, it also provides that additional context and can increase the value of your message. And then encouraged by economic support, the agriculture food sector is valued by Albertans, and hearing about how agriculture and food sector contributes to areas that are important to them, like jobs and economy, that's a great place to start, is using how jobs and economy can be a good hook in your key message. And then also that they're positive about government support, and that the government is building and supporting the industry and supporting economic growth. Those things were well received by our participants. And lastly, the desire for more information. So I think this one's kind of the important one, that now's sort of the time to get out there and tell our story, because Albertans are open and receptive to information. They want to learn more about the agriculture and food sector, and I think now's our time to start communicating about it. All right, so some of our considerations from the quantitative assessment. So this was the survey of the 801 Albertans. And really, a take-home is that Albertans are positive about agriculture. So that's great. So let's use this positivity to increase awareness and knowledge. Now is a great time because, as you know, if people get negative or have a negative impression, it is so much more challenging to have, you know, those open, honest dialogues with people if they're already coming from a place of negativity. But if they're positive and open to learning, that's a great opportunity to continue telling our story. It's also important to provide your sources because it builds credibility and Albertans will believe the message. So either state the data source or provide a link to it, because as we found out, Albertans, they're willing to look up for more information. So use those tools and those links if you can. And this would be especially important in those areas that there might be more skepticism, you know, from the certain different generations. They might want to say, okay, you said this statement, but where are you getting this information? And that could help address some of that credibility. Also, to increase, and this is kind of on government, increase our awareness about government's role. Is there, you know, they weren't necessarily understanding of what government's role is in supporting the industry, and if we can do that, I think that would be positive and maybe show how we're being collaborative. There might be a collaborative opportunity to communicate how government and industry are working together to be successful. And then also pair up your messages, right? We kind of saw how jobs and economy are important to Albertans. So if you can use jobs and economy as sort of the hook, and then tell them about how technology and sustainability, some of those other areas, also contribute and help with jobs and the economy, I think that's great. I'll give a plug for our statistics and data development section. They do develop an annual agriculture facts, so it's a great resource to start with. They have tons of facts on kind of economic and job facts. That is a good starting point. And then lastly, as we saw, target your demographics and your messaging because there's some differences. And I was kind of surprised at how different they are. So I am going to elaborate on this one a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So some key demographic differences. What we found is that, yeah, the majority of Albertans are positive about agriculture, but we do kind of have to be wary that Gen Z is a little bit more negative, and those are kind of our new consumers, right? They're that 18 to 25-year-olds, and they're just getting into, you know, kind of buying their own food and that type of thing. So we have to be aware that that generation might be a little bit more negative. So, and what was also interesting when we kind of when I looked at the forest through the trees, we sort of found that there's a bit of a too much information gap. So remember we had asked about whether they agreed if the message had too much information. And when you kind of looked at all the messages and all of the reactions, there was definitely a gap between Gen Z millennials and then Gen X's and boomers. So Gen Zs and millennials were more likely to say there was too much information than Gen X and boomers. And this also occurred between urban and rural. Less surprising that urban might not necessarily have as much background and knowledge in agriculture and food. So they felt that the messaging had too much information. And then lastly, one key message is that the Alberta food system is important to most, right? So one area that they kind of indicated it's less important is Gen Z. So Gen Z, if you remember, they were sort of least likely to give it a high importance rating, and then also between urban residents and rural residents. So this is sort of an important consideration as we're developing our messages. But then what are the opportunities in that. I think that does present us with some opportunities. So there is, as we saw in the beginning, 1/3 of Albertans are sort of neutral. So they're sitting on the fence. They don't know whether they're positive or negative about agriculture in Alberta. So if we can craft some great key messages, then maybe we can get that body of people to move to the positive side. And through that, what I found interesting is that lots of people from Gen Z and millennials said, I learned something new from this statement. So I think that's positive. So getting those key messages out there is helping to increase awareness and knowledge of the industry. So I think that's a great opportunity out of this. And then it's also important to note that all of those messages did improve the overall impression about agriculture. So they're, Albertans are sort of hungry for information, and our key messages, whether some were more effective than others, they still overall improved the impression of agriculture, and that's great. So we sort of have an opportunity that, consumers, they trust farmers, and most want to learn about food. So I think this is a great environment to go out there and be getting our messages out there. So now that we kind of have a little bit of a better idea how to craft that key message that will stick, then we can head out and start sharing some of the wonderful things that this industry does in Alberta. All right, so that's it. Hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions or comments or insights. It's certainly welcome. I'm going to actually stop sharing because I can't see the screen in the presenter view. So I'll stop sharing, and then we can have that Q&A, and I'll try my best to answer some questions.
Thanks, Laura, for that very, very insightful key messages for building public trust presentation.